now we are talking about it from the economic and finance end. And this is so critical because it affects all of us much more than a situation where people think, well, I don't live in the shale area, so it doesn't involve me as much. This business with Deborah Rogers tonight is going to put this whole issue in your lap. And I hope that you really will start learning more. If you would like to learn more, we've had some free handout books that I'm pleased to see have already been taken up by people outside. But there is one caveat. It is a requirement if you have taken one of these. You don't have to pay for it, but you have to pass it on. This does not live well on a shelf. And it has to be the kind of message. If you do nothing more than help by spreading the word, you will have accomplished a great deal of what tonight is all about. The other thing is that we had a few copies, which again is generously considered important, that Ms. Rogers has produced. And this particular study is available online. So again, if you find the talk interesting this evening, there are ways for you to enrich and give a greater depth to that information. About 2 years ago, I first became familiar with some of the work that Deborah Rogers was doing. And of course, for someone who had been in the trenches trying to educate the public, this was absolute manna from heaven. Because we all need the information that is researched, that has a good focus, very pointedly on what they're trying to say, and her materials always targeted very clearly and with language that all of us could understand what needed to be learned. So I've learned a great deal from this woman, and I wanted so much for her to be able to come. So again, I personally thank the sponsors who have helped us to make this possible. Now, the one thing that you will always learn, and I'm not going to go into a bio because you all have a chance to read this on the back. I just want to say this personally. When you get to a point in working in any kind of controversial area, you will be able to measure the level of your success by the people who criticize you. Because until you start making an impact, you really can't tell if they're even paying attention. And so, having been a fortunate person to receive the name Fracking by one of our leading companies, I take great pleasure in introducing to you the mother of all shale gas steam. And this is Deborah Rogers.
That was an industry group called Energy and Depth that's what they said. So I was the mother of all steam. Thank you, Julia. Okay, I am going to, first of all, thank you for having me here tonight. I am delighted to be back in Arkansas. I love Arkansas. I've been coming here since I was a tiny little girl. My parents first brought me here to go camping. And I don't even, these were some of my first memories. So I've always had a soft spot in my heart for Arkansas. And it was just lovely flying in last night and seeing it. I always forget how beautiful it is until I see it again. So thank you for having me. I am going to cover a tremendous amount of information in a very short period of time. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Turn it up a little. How about that? In fact, how long is that for? I'll get carried away. Okay. So I'm going to cover a lot of information. I'm going to cover it very quickly. But then I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. And please, I will stand here tonight until you have your very last question. I will give as much time to this as you want me to. Let's get started. Okay, I am of the opinion that shale should have come unraveled shortly after the economic downturn in 2008. The reason they didn't is because the large Wall Street investment banks, and by these I refer to them as the usual suspects, the Goldman Sachs, the Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, etc., they saw an opportunity essentially to substitute shales for mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, and other financial products that were based on mortgage-backed securities, or mortgage-backed financial products. And they used essentially the same playbook, which was rather interesting. You may recall that when the banks were selling derivatives, there were a number of things that they did. They used off-balance sheet financing. You know what I'm saying? Okay, how about that? They used off-balance sheet financing. They bundled mortgages. They sold securities to people who weren't sophisticated enough to understand what they were buying. And they reverse engineered products to meet rating agencies' higher standards. And you will see that in sales, they've essentially done the same thing. This is a quote from Barclays Capital executive. He actually won an award from Risk Magazine, which is a mergers and acquisitions magazine, quite well known within the financial industry. And he is essentially stating here what I just went over. He said the main challenges in putting together the Chesapeake BPP deal, and by the way, BPP is a form of off-balance sheet financing called volumetric production payment, and Chesapeake Energy, as others, but they in particular, were very fond of these products. We're getting the structure right and guiding the ratings agencies and institutional investors who did not necessarily have a deep familiarity with the energy business. Now, I have a problem with this because those institutional investors that he's referring to are pension funds. That means people's retirement monies were going into investments that the people who were in charge of these funds didn't really understand. The difference here, as you're going to see as we go along, is that these banks, instead of keeping the toxic assets on their own books, which is what they did with mortgage-backed securities, and they learned their lesson. These are clever boys, and girls, but primarily boys. They learned their lesson, and they this time used the same playbook, and but let the oil and gas companies keep the toxic assets on their books, which was, as you will see, will be much better for the banks, but not so good for the shale companies. Now, as you will recall, the banks also bundled mortgages. Well, in the case of shales, they bundled leases, and shale plays actually became land grabs. That was the primary business and has been the primary business of shale plays. They would go in and offer a farmer sometimes $500, sometimes more. In my area, when it got into the urban areas in Fort Worth, the leasing cost actually went up to $30,000 an acre. That was most unusual. Stayed there for a very short period of time and then dropped back down. But primarily they were offering about $500 an acre, sometimes as much as $1,000. That's about the average that people have been offered in every shale play across the U.S. And then they were turning around, drilling a handful of wells and pronouncing the entire play proved up. And I'll go into more detail on that in a moment. And they were flipping it to other investors within the oil and gas industry for as much as $25,000 an acre. So you can see this was a very lucrative business for these companies. This is a quote. Chesapeake Energy CEO Aubrey McClendon was actually bragging to financial analysts about this. And he says unequivocally, I can assure you that buying leases for X and selling them for 5 to 10 times X is a lot more profitable than trying to produce gas. And he says at $5 or $6 an MCF. We haven't seen gas at $5 or $6 an MCF in quite some time, since about maybe 2009, 2010. So a lot of people within the industry have accused me of being conspiracy theorists. They say, well, that's a very nice conspiracy theory, Deborah. Well, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I believe in math, and the math is actually very, very simple indeed. All you have to do to figure out where the price is going, or was going, I spotted this back in early 2010, was these production targets up here in the top line. That is the primary metric for oil and gas companies. And if you're an analyst, the first thing you want to hear from an oil and gas company is, I have met your production target. And what they mean is, we've grown our production X percentage year over year, and that means that the company is healthy, they're finding new oil and gas deposits, and they're bringing them to market. So it's one of the very first metrics and one of the very primary metrics that analysts look for, and investors as well. So these companies are going to do pretty much everything they can. They're going to jump through any hoop they can in order to meet these targets, because if they don't meet them, then that analyst will in turn downgrade their stock, and that they don't have as much money available to them, or the money is more expensive for them. So you take existing production, and then you add those production targets onto it, and that's going to let you know what, how much gas you're going to have, or oil. You can go out 12, 24 months in advance based on these production targets. So I did that, and then I looked at what the current demand was in the U.S., and I could tell that we were going to have a significant surplus in natural gas. Now, when you have a surplus, that equals blood. And if you have a glut, prices go in one direction and one direction only. So it was very clear that prices were going to start trending down. And that's exactly what happened. Interestingly enough, though, when the price of gas started trending down, the large investment banks saw that as an opportunity. And indeed it was. And they turned around to the majors, the ExxonMobils, the Shells, Chevrons, and so forth of the world, who had never been interested in shales, because they said in the early days, we can't make this work. We're not, the gas isn't there, and we can't make the numbers work. And they were never interested in shales. But now, because the SEC had also changed the rule for oil and gas, and I'm going to get into that in more detail in just a moment, but they had changed the rule for oil and gas in 2009. And basically they stated that you could now add shale reserves onto your books. And so you could expand your reserve base. And that's also a metric that analysts look for, because they want to see if you have, it looks like your reserves are growing, then again, it looks like your company is healthier and you're financially more healthy. So when they turned around to the majors, these investment banks, and they said, you can now go in, because the price is dropping, you can go in and we can help you facilitate these deals, and you can pick them up for cents on the dollar. Now, as you can see, this is the price of natural gas in 2008, about $8. As that price started to fall, the value of the mergers and acquisitions deals in shales went up significantly. It went up from $15 billion in 2008 to $50 billion in 2009. 38, 47, and in 2012 it was like another 56 billion. That is an interesting correlation, because that translates into very, very significant fees for these banks. And as it turned out, amazingly enough, imagine this, shales turned out to be the #1 profit center for a lot of these large Wall Street banks. It took over the space left from the mortgage-backed securities. So they just transferred one basically toxic asset for another, and made a whole lot of money doing that. So, do I have a problem with investment bankers making large fees off investment deals? No. Investment banking is a very critical part of our financial system, and it's a very needed part. What I have a problem with is that these banks went in and facilitated these deals, and there's no way, I can tell you, having worked in that business for a number of years, there's absolutely no way that you could do proper due diligence on any of these deals and not know that those underlying assets were not performing properly. And indeed, that's what happened. These, within a matter of months, the deals that the banks had made a whole lot of money off of in generating fees went south on the buyers. The one that you're going to be probably most familiar with is this one, BHP Billiton. And they went in and bought all of Chesapeake Energy's Fayetteville shale assets. They paid about $4 billion for them. And 18 months later, only 18 months later, they wrote off over 50% of what they paid for them. You see, these are all asset write-downs. In Canada, $1.7 billion, Quicksilver, $2 billion, BP, $2.1. And these numbers have grown since then, by the way. Chesapeake is now up to, I think, $3.5 billion, 3.4, something like that. Devon has larger impairment charges, and even now the majors are even now taking large asset write-downs on U.S. shale assets. In the last quarter, both Shell and ExxonMobil announced huge write-downs. Shell took about $2 billion in a write-down, and Peter Vosser, who's just now stepping down, about to step down as CEO of Shell, gave an interview to the London Financial Times last week, in which he stated that one of the things he regrets most about his tenure as CEO of Shell was his investment in U.S. shale assets. Shell, by the way, is planning to sell at least 50% of their assets off over the next year or two. And ExxonMobil took a 60% hit to earnings from their shale assets. Now, when you get companies that are this size of the ExxonMobils of the world, and they can take a 60% hit to assets off of shale assets, then you know you've got a real problem with the underlying well performance and production. Fracking. So let's go into kind of the background and what's actually going on in shale and why aren't they what the industry has purported them to be. By the way, I wish I'd coined this phrase, but I didn't. It came from the London Financial Times, but I've always loved it, so I had an next slide for it. So why are shale so hyped? I think it's because of competition. You don't hear a lot about this yet. You will start to hear more and more, but you don't hear a lot about it yet in the mainstream financial press. And that is what's going on with what they call the clean economy and clean investments. And by that, I mean large-scale wind and solar, geothermal. There are quite a number of things that encompass that. But the clean economy, believe it or not, during the economic downturn grew at 8.3%. So it was robust during the economic downturn. I can also tell you that you actually have deals being put together right now as we speak, and even in the last year, involving people like MetLife or institutions like MetLife and people like Warren Buffett, who are putting significant amounts of money into renewable projects. And believe it or not, they're locking in double-digit rates of return in this interest rate environment. And they're locking them in for anywhere from 20 to 25 years. That's incredible. And that is not lost on the oil and gas industry. We hear a lot about jobs from the oil and gas industry. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's kind of funny. When we hear these glowing jobs numbers from the industry of 600,000 jobs and so forth, where they're getting those numbers is from economic models. And anybody who's taken Economics 101 knows that you can essentially reverse engineer any economic model and have it say exactly what you want it to say at the end of the day. And that's exactly what they've done. And so what they do is they take the number of direct industry jobs and then they apply a multiplier to it. So let's say you have 200,000 direct industry jobs, and we're going to apply a multiplier of 3 to it, and that's going to get us to the 600,000, right? Only when we went in and did some work on this, and others have done too, and started parsing out what industry was considering indirect jobs, they were including jobs like strippers and prostitutes in the mix. Now, admittedly, that's job creation, right? But it's not the sort of job creation that you or I think about when we hear President Obama say we're going to create 600,000 jobs from shale gas. We certainly don't think that the President is talking about creating jobs for strippers and prostitutes. So, going back to direct industry jobs, these are the jobs that these people strictly work for industry. These aren't outside peripheral jobs. And they're, to my mind, they're a better measurement. I took these figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and as you can see, oil and gas employs approximately 181,000. It's gone up a little bit since I pulled these numbers, but anyway, this is still roughly the same. 181,000 direct industry jobs. Renewables, and I just included wind, solar, and geothermal in that, no other renewables, they employ approximately 183,000 people. Now, you've got equal number of jobs, roughly, but you can't stop there. You've got to look at how many jobs have been created per kilowatt generating capacity. And so I went in and checked that, and oil and gas accounts for about 45% of total kilowatt generating capacity, whereas renewables only count for about 15%. But do you see what's happened here? It means that renewables are creating significantly more jobs per kilowatt than oil and gas. I can promise you that is not lost on the oil and gas industry. That is why every time you turn on your television, I'm assuming it's the same here as it is in Texas, that you see these advertisements with the industry telling us how many jobs they've created. They know they're not keeping up with renewables, and they're trying to just get it in everyone's mind that they are creating jobs, when in fact they're lagging significantly. So let's go into the majors again. The majors, this is another thing that most people don't realize.
the majors, and by that I'm talking about the big boys, the ExxonMobils, the Shell, the Chevrons, ConocoPhillips. The majors, without exception, have not been able to grow reserves in a meaningful way for over a decade. So when the SEC changed the rules and broadened the definition of shale reserves, the majors saw that as an opportunity to go in and basically, they're not finding any new oil and gas. They're just simply taking from this pile over here and scooping it into their larger pile here. These aren't new reserves of oil and gas, but it makes it look like ExxonMobil is growing, or Shell is growing their reserves because they bought them. More than 25% typically per annum of reserve replacement for the majors for the last decade has been nothing but consolidation, buying other people's assets and scooping them into their bigger pile. That's a little bit of a problem because it's showing us all that these companies are struggling to find significant new, plays of hydrocarbon or fields of hydrocarbons. The other interesting thing about the majors is that they've been doing a little bit of it's perfectly legal, but I think it's a little bit of accounting sleight of hand in that they've been going in and buying back their own shares. This is Rex Tillerson of ExxonMobil, CEO of ExxonMobil, and they're a classic example. ExxonMobil, believe it or not, has been buying back their own shares to the tune of $5 billion per quarter for quite a number of years now. Now, why would you do that? Well, it's quite simple. It goes back to those metrics I was talking about earlier with analysts. One of the other metrics that analysts or even investors look at is earnings per share. And so if you're not growing your earnings in a robust manner, then the best way to counteract that is to buy back your shares so that now you have this earnings number and you're dividing it into a smaller number of shares, which makes it look as though, on the surface of things, that you're growing your earnings. They're on an upward trajectory, when in fact your business may be sort of stagnating. And that has been occurring with the majors. The other interesting thing, and this again, I'm going to give you an example from Exxon, is reserve replacement. Another primary metric. You look and see, because if you're an oil and gas company and you're not replacing your reserves on an annual basis in a meaningful way, then you're drawing down your capital essentially. I mean, it's very simple. You've got to go in and replace what people are using or consuming, what you're selling off. So they announced their reserve replacement for 2012, and it was very, very interesting because they gave glowing, language in the first paragraph or two, and then you got down into the meat of it, and they just threw out figures then. But I was sitting there trying to divide figures into other figures, and I realized suddenly that 40%, a full 40% of ExxonMobil's reserve replacement was coming from 2 shale plays. And I'm going to go into more detail on those plays in just a moment. But 2 shale plays. One of them was the Woodford, and the Woodford is done. I mean, it's down to 2 rigs now from 85. And the other one is the Bakken, and the Bakken is touted as the poster child for shale oil. But interestingly enough, the per well production in the Bakken peaked back in June of 2010. They've more than doubled the number of wells. We're going to go into that as well. That's what we refer to as the drilling treadmill. They've more than doubled the number of wells since 2010, but per well production has not gone up. So you will see the Bakken peak very shortly. So you can see there's a problem for the majors. Recovery efficiencies for shales. In conventional oil and gas fields, you could typically count on, traditionally, that you could pull out somewhere between 75 and 80% of the gas or oil in place. With shales, we're finding that they're recovering approximately 6.5%. That's the average. It runs anywhere from 4% to 10% depending on the play. 6.5 is the average. So the recovery efficiency is dismal. It's just awful. Energy return on energy invested. This is a quick ratio that we look at to see how much energy are you spending to get energy out? So how many barrels of oil are you burning to get X number of barrels out? And we write this as a ratio. So in the early days of crude, we expended 1 barrel of oil to get 100 barrels of crude out. Today, it's about 1 to get 11 barrels out. But when you start getting into these unconventionals like tar sands and shale oil, the numbers drop quite dramatically, and they almost become not net energy efficient. So tar sands are running at 3 to 1. They're still doing work on shale oil, but it looks like it's going to come in at about 4 to 5 to 1, maybe even as low as 3 to 1. So we now globally have a troubling dependence on low OEI fuels, which means that we're expending a whole lot of energy to get very little in return. And what I'm trying to say to you here is that at some point, it just doesn't make sense anymore. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Now, externalities. This is something that the industry never wants to talk about, and it's something that politicians often don't want to hear, and they certainly don't want to deal with, but they've become very real indeed. Excuse me, I chose road damages for tonight. There are also healthcare costs, health impact costs, or agriculture costs, and so forth. These are the costs that are borne by the taxpayers and local, thank you so much, local municipalities, based on this heavy industrial activity that's going on. So let's just look at road damages here. This figure for Texas is from 2012, and this industry likes to tell us about the severance tax revenue, and they brag and boast about it quite a lot, and they say we pay, a lot of money in severance taxes, and they do. The problem is the severance taxes don't cover the damages they've done. Somebody's going to have to pick up the difference. So in the state of Texas, and this includes all oil and gas, onshore and offshore, not just shales, the severance tax revenue was $3.6 billion in 2012, but the damage estimated by TxDOT just from shale drilling around the state is $4 billion. So we've got a shortfall. By the way, all these numbers come from state comptrollers and State Department of Transportation. North Dakota revenue, $3.3 billion since 2010, cumulatively. Road damages from the Bakken, $7 billion. Arkansas, you've taken in $182 million since 2009, but your road damages are now estimated to be $450 million. Pennsylvania was very foolish indeed. They wanted so badly for the drillers to come into Pennsylvania and start drilling in the Marcellus that they gave them a pass on severance taxes. They didn't even make them pay severance taxes. They finally wised up because they realized that they were on the wrong end of this deal. And in 2012, they started collecting what they call an impact fee. So far, they've taken in $204 million in their impact fee, but their road damages are, and this is just to maintain the existing roads, $3.5 billion from PennDOT, but they said to actually do it right and fix the roads, $7 billion. Somebody's going to pick that up, and I can tell you it ain't going to be the oil and gas companies. So essentially what these companies are doing is they're privatizing profits and socializing costs. Lack of confidence within the industry. That's been very interesting to me indeed. There are quite a number of examples. If you look in the Marcellus, North Energy put all of their assets up for sale in December of 2011, and they were supposed to have some of the best assets in the Marcellus, and by December of 2012, they still had no takers and they had to declare bankruptcy. Anschutz Exploration let all of their leases in the Marcellus expire. They just let it expire. They didn't think it was even worth fighting for them anymore. But my favorite is, because this one is most unusual, my favorite is out of the box. I actually wrote an article on this, and it got picked up by a number of industry publications because it really is odd what happened. In the Bakken, which is the poster child for shale oil, one of the top partners went in and they wanted to build a pipeline from the Bakken formation down to Cushing, Oklahoma. They couldn't get one single other entity to go in on it with them. Now, why is this strange? Because pipelines are cash